Hi there. So the grammar you need to study for your upcoming test deals with conditionals. Conditional sentences are kind of like cause and effect type sentences, right? So we have a condition, right? And once we have that condition, it leads to a certain effect. Note that conditional clauses or conditional sentences are also divided into two parts. We have the condition part, and then we have the part of the sentence that describes the effect. I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but keep that in the back of your mind. So conditional sentences describe the result of something that will, could, or might happen, or things that could have happened in the past but didn't. And for each of these kinds of senses that we want to express, we have a conditional form that is made using certain verb tenses, right? So keep that in mind too when we talk about the conditional, the zero conditional and the first conditional, which we are going to do for your test preparation. Now, even though we are only doing two forms, I want you to know that there are generally 4 types of conditional sentences. These are also sometimes called if sentences, because the if is the condition under which we get a certain result, right, or a certain effect. The 4 types are the zero conditional, the first conditional, the second conditional, and the third conditional. For our purposes, we're only going to worry about conditionals 0 and 1, and we'll come back to the others a bit later. Now, the zero conditional we use when we want to talk about things that are facts or things that are true. For example, if it's hot, ice melts, right? That's a scientific fact. The hotter it gets, the higher the chances that ice will melt. If you ship by air, it gets there faster, right? And this is a kind of a truth. Imagine this is a freight forwarder talking about the difference between shipping by air, rail, and ship. If you ship by air, it gets there faster, obviously because planes are a bit quicker. The first conditional, so before we move on to the first conditional, have a look at the verb tenses there. If you ship by air, it gets there faster. You'll notice that the verb tense in both clauses, both parts, in the condition part of the sentence and the effect part, are present tenses, in this case present simple. The first conditional is when we want to express something that is likely to happen, something that is possible, right? Something that we think could happen or might happen or will happen, right? So, if you have a look at the example there, if the customer doesn't pay, the shipment won't be dispatched, right? This is where we are speculating. We also use it for speculation. Imagine the customer doesn't pay. If the customer doesn't pay, this will be what we will do, right? So this is when we make plans to contingency plans to in case something goes wrong, or we use it to speculate, or we use it to talk about things that are possible or likely. The second conditional we use to talk about impossible things, right? Or unlikely things. If we bought 10 new vessels, we would become the biggest cargo line in the world, right? This is the kind of, if I won the lottery, I would buy myself a Ferrari, right? It's stuff that we see as very unlikely. This is what we use to fantasize and to dream, right? So often we use it as to talk about things that are fantasy. The third conditional, in this type of sentence, we are talking about things that didn't happen and their imagined consequences. I know that doesn't make much sense when you read it like that, but let's have a look at the sentence. If they had sent that shipment on time, we would have paid them on time, right? So we're talking about something that someone should have done, but they didn't. But if they had done that, then things would have been different. The result would have been different. So we use it to talk about how results could have been different if the conditions were different. Okay, so as I said, we're going to study the zero conditional and the first conditional. The second and the third is for a later stage. So what are conditional sentences? Conditional sentences can be broken up into two parts or two clauses. We have the main clause and then we have the if clause, right? The main clause, which is also sometimes called the conditional clause, and then we have the if clause. So, if you have a look there, the shipment will get there on time if you send it today. So you'll see where the if is, that breaks up the sentence into its two parts, right? The shop will order the jeans if they can receive them next month. The conditional clause, this one, the first one in this case, the conditional clause expresses a result, right? That happens because of the action in the if clause, right? So the conditional clause is the effect, right? And the if clause is the conditions that are necessary for that effect to happen, right? It is the action that the effect is a result of. Or to put it differently, when we do what the if clause expresses, then what is expressed in the conditional clause will be the result. So for the zero conditional, if this happens, then this happens. For the first conditional, if this happens, then this will happen. Notice here that in both clauses, we are using the present tense. With the first conditional, the if clause is present and the conditional clause is future, right? And actually it doesn't matter whether it's the future with will or going to, it can be any form of the future, but that conditional clause always has the future. You will notice too that in these sentences I started with if. If this happens, comma, then this happens. So your if clause, you can start a conditional sentence with an if clause, but when you do that, you have to put a comma before the conditional clause. If you start your sentence the other way around, with the conditional clause, like in these two examples here, then there is no comma in between, right? Okay, let's move to the next page. Okay, so, and that's what's in the note here is what I was just explaining. We can change the order of the clauses. Have a look at the two examples. I will fill in the bill of lading if he asks me to, right? That's your first conditional there. And it starts with the conditional clause and ends with the if clause. Or, if he asks me to, comma, I'll fill in the bill of lading, right? So it's just the other way around. It still makes perfect sense, except that you have the if clause and then the conditional clause with a comma in between. So we use a comma to separate the clauses when the sentence starts with the if clause. So let's have a look at them in detail there. The zero conditional, with a zero conditional, we use the present tense in both clauses. Have a look at the example. Shipments take longer. That take is present simple, right? It's not takes because it's shipments, which is plural. Shipments take longer if weather conditions are bad. The are, that verb to be, is in the present simple as well. If we start with the if clause, it's the same. If weather conditions are bad, we've got if in the present tense, shipments take longer, right? And you've got that take in the present tense there. So we use the zero conditional to make statements of fact or to express general truths. And remember that both clauses are in the present tense. In the first conditional, we use the future tense in the conditional clause and the present tense in the if clause. I'll, it's contracted to I'll dispatch the shipment if the customer confirms the order. So there you've got future, and here you've got present, right? If you switch it around and you do the word order differently, if the customer confirms the order, comma, I will dispatch the shipment. So it's the same, doesn't matter what the order is. The if clause gets the present tense and the conditional clause the future. Because the conditional clause has the future tense in it, it is also sometimes called the future conditional, right? And another reason for that is that the whole sentence, both clauses, refer to a future time, even though the if clause is always in the present tense. So with conditionals, don't think of the verb tense as indicating the time, present, future, past. The verb tense does not indicate the time. You have to consider what time the whole sentence is a reference to, because the clauses use different verb tenses. And in fact, the second and the third conditionals get a little bit more complicated as well. So using past tense to indicate a future, a present, a present time, and so on. So it's useful to think of what time frame the whole sentence is referencing, and forget about thinking about the time as being bound to the verb tenses. Now, I've got a note here. It says we can use any form of the future tense in the conditional clause of the first conditional and any one of the present tenses in the if clause. And then there are some examples there. We've got the future with going to in the conditional clause there. We're not going to send the order if the client doesn't pay, right? Going to, and then the present, right? In the if clause here, we've used the present continuous. If the client isn't taking the payment date seriously, the order won't be sent. Right? So again, it can be the if clauses in the present, the conditional clauses in the future, but we can use different forms of the present tense and different forms of the future tense, depending on what we are trying to say. Now, the first conditional has a few conversational uses. The first use that we have for it in conversation is to persuade or to convince someone. For example, I'll fill in the export documents if you call the client to negotiate a better price. In this case, we do it when we want to convince someone else to do some job that you don't want to do. In the home environment, I'll cook dinner if you take out the stinky garbage. Right? So we often do it to persuade other people to do things that we don't want to do ourselves. Then, warning. We use the first conditional to warn people about stuff. For example, if you don't confirm the shipment by tonight, it'll be too late to get the container onto the vessel. Right? If you don't confirm by tonight, it won't be possible to put it on the vessel any longer. So that's a warning. You'd better get it done on time. For students, if you don't study, you will fail. Right? That's also a kind of conditional that we use to warn. And then to threaten. Right? When we want to say that there will be serious consequences for a certain action. For example, if there are any mistakes in the export documents again, you'll be fired. There should be a comma there. Okay? If there are any mistakes in the export documents again, you'll be fired. Of course, fired means to lose your job because you've done something wrong, right? Okay, so can you recognize the type of conditional? Write 0 or 1 next to each sentence below. And what you have to do here is to decide whether it's a 0 conditional, so is it a statement of fact, or a first conditional? Is it a persuasion, a warning, a threat? Or does it reference a future time? I'm not going to do this because I think you guys need to try this on your own, but I will post the answers for you at some point. Okay, and that is your task for this week. If you have any questions, let me know.